Currently, I sit on the Oregon Bike Racing Association's DEI committee as one of their co-chairs. I also currently chair the Westside Transportation Alliance, and recently I co-founded a BIPOC cycling collective called BIPOC PNW, and we recently just received the Elizabeth Jennings Graham Award for Transportation Equity Justice at the Alice Awards this last weekend, so I'm pretty excited about that. You know, I'll tell you, so I'm passionate about the topic of transportation equity, particularly as it pertains to cycling as a mode of getting around. So for me and the communities I interact with, it means finding ways to overcome the hurdles of gentrification due to the machinations of the cycling industry and the co-opting of bicycles as sport in lieu of their utility as tools for transportation.
Fantastic. How about let's hear from Chris?
My name is Chris Billman. I live out in Gallows Creek, Oregon. Transportation is really important because everybody does it. There's nobody that has everything under one roof. So we have to go from point A to point B. And my main concern is bicycle with people with disabilities and adaptive mobility devices. And as we move along with our bicycle plan, it seems everybody thinks bicycles are for recreation and recreation only. So I was able to introduce House Bill 2985, which actually made our transportation industry recognize bicycles as something for a mobility device other than a wheelchair. I was also the first person in the state of Oregon to get disability parking permits from DMV to a bicycle. And that was the first in the state, and I don't know if they've done any more than that. And that's pretty much it. I've done a lot of educating in the Sea of Forest Road and on the Unpack as far as people with adaptive bikes and disabilities need to be included in all bicycle pedestrian programs. That's pretty much it.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's hear from Hau.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you for the invitation for participating on this panel. Hi, my name is Hau Hagedorn. I use she, her pronouns. I was born in Vietnam, and I am a first-generation Vietnamese refugee. And I have been working in transportation for nearly 25 years. So when I graduated from college, almost 25 years ago, with a degree in civil engineering, I represented 12% of civil engineers that were female, with even fewer women of color. So I think the lack of peers and transportation professionals that look like me is very much the reason why I'm committed to increasing diversity in transportation. So my current position at the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University, I am responsible for developing and growing research and education programs. And that includes increasing diversity in education and the transportation workforce. Just a little bit about TREC's research. We address complex transportation problems that draw from multiple disciplines, including engineering, planning, economics, and design. And a growing area of research for TREC is better understanding the travel needs of marginalized communities to better serve these people. So we know that they suffer from harassment and bias on transit. There are racial and economic disparities when it comes to safety for people who walk and bike, both personal and traffic violence. And we know that their perspectives are underrepresented in travel surveys, which are used by transportation agencies to plan for transportation infrastructure. And when we look at the transportation infrastructure, it tends to continue to serve the privileged. And so these are just some examples of the research areas that we work on that relates to transportation equity issues. Thanks.
Okay, Juan Carlos.
Hola a todos. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is Juan Carlos. I am a Metro counselor, and I represent the West Side at the regional table, specifically North and West Washington County. I've been a counselor for 3 years now, and I feel like I sleep transportation and breathe it, eat it. You know, it's my life. It's become a passion of mine, and through every venue that I have at Metro, and constantly working on transportation justice, one for communities of color and access, basic infrastructure like sidewalks, crosswalks, bus shelters, but also looking at it at a really high picture level of how transportation is the most powerful tool that we have as individuals and as a collective to address climate change. And I'm really excited to be on the panel. I don't know if I think I forgot to mention my pronouns, but he, him, and I'm really, really excited to be here, and I'm excited to answer any questions y'all have.
Fantastic. And John?
Hi, my name is John Carter. Thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. He, him. I work at Portland Community College and connect students in the broader community with resources and access to get around the region, and we're pretty all-encompassing around the metro, so it ends up being quite a lot. So, I mean, I think transportation equity is really important to me because at the end of the day, like, you know, mobility is the key of how we, like, how an individual gets to participate in society. And we, as a country, for the past 70 years, have been disastrously investing in this one transportation mode, driving, that is incredibly expensive. Whether it's, you know, buying and maintaining a car for the individual or the broader society of keeping the infrastructure going, because it tends to crumble pretty quickly. So I think that when it comes to transportation equity, it really is about figuring out, like, you know, how do we get ourselves out of this mess that is going to kill us with climate change and is also making us miserable without, you know, people getting left behind. How do we lift all boats up? Because, you know, as we'll talk about, you know, I was looking at the questions later on, you know, you've had, you know, gentrification associated with mobility options that are other than driving alone. And it's like, how do we improve our environment and ways of getting around without leaving people behind? I think it's really important.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Truly an amazing group on our panel here. I'm excited to hear more from you. So our second question is for Juan Carlos, Chris, and Will. What are the main barriers to transportation options in your community? What disparities in transportation are you most concerned about? Juan Carlos, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm really lucky because at Metro I have a staff of really smart people that work on creating plans and assessing disparities in system, service levels, and all that. But I think, like, at a really high level, I think what I would mention for main barriers is the lack of resources. I think that for the last few decades, local governments have done a lot of engagement. What kind of things do you want to see here? And our communities, you know, they say the same thing every year. I want a sidewalk here. I want a bus cover. I want a bus stop. And unfortunately, I think where the crux of the issue is a fundamental lack of resources to be able to go and build it, deliver adequate service, make it reliable and a competitive option for people to get out of the vehicles, but also to have to be safe. That for me is a big issue that I get to work on at Metro and is one of my key priorities, actually. Aside from that, I would say I'm excited to see a lot more community organizing happening in Washington County with the Southwest Corridor project, the light rail project that TriMet has been planning. There's a Southwest Corridor Equitable Development Coalition, and it's basically a coalition of community leaders of color, working to do some advocacy with the plan, but also for the kind of additional impacts that happen with big transportation projects, displacement, small businesses, housing costs, land value increasing, and really making these major investments, really mitigating those impacts and amplifying the benefits to make sure that people take advantage of that. And one of my things that I really think that we should be doing is creating more community coalitions across corridors to build support for that, especially in our arterials. And I'll leave it there for now and let the other great folks answer.
Chris, do you have some thoughts to share?
I do. In Forest Grove, our biggest issue is the city's definition of a bicycle. We don't have the ORSs in our area that are similar to others. Our bicycles were taken out of transportation and put into recreation. So if your main mode of transportation, if you're disabled using a bicycle, it's put to the recreation department. And so that automatically puts you on the outside. Now, our big business that we have is located outside of town, and they're in agricultural areas. We have lots of nurseries and vineyards and various places that use lots of low-income labor. We have a lot of housing in our area, but we don't have the connection to get from low-income housing to the shop market, to the end of the bus stop, and then out to the field. When the bus stops at the end of town, you still have 4 miles to go to your location, your nursery where you work. Simple things like if you get on the road with a bicycle, so when a guy goes by, slap the thing, just let you go through the tunnel. Now, at least the farm workers tell the drivers that somebody's on the road with a bicycle. They go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, it's blacked out, and they're anonymous. Our surveys are done at 10 o'clock on the busy intersections. They totally miss the population. That's all.
Thank you. Will, do you have some thoughts to add?
Oh, yeah, that's why I'm here, right? So I definitely want to echo everything that Chris and Councilor Gonzalez had said. And it's interesting that Chris would bring up business and just connection, and then Juan Carlos would be talking about community-based organizations. I think whether we're talking about Portland proper or the metro spaces, you know, I think we can all agree it's definitely the same things that we've heard before that are prohibitive. So we're talking about safety, convenience, ease of use, cost, etc. I think what I'd really like to get us to think about is we don't see or hear or talk about the responsibility on private and public employers to incentivize, to encourage, to scaffold, and create environments where multimodal transportations are prioritized. So at the end of the day, you know, in my opinion, I feel like employers hold a share of the responsibility for how their employees get to work. And so, you know, to Juan Carlos's point about community-based organizations, yes, they can do it, they can make those connections, they can do everything they can, but to Chris's point, I feel like the businesses have to start stepping up to start creating that greater connection just across the community.
If I can get 1 second. A simple thing like a shuttle bus that leaves Cultural Central and the end of the bus line that makes a nursery run so that we get safe transportation outside of the city limits to those people who need it the most.
Thank you all. Our next question is for Hau and Juan Carlos. What is the value in having transportation options for individuals and communities? Hau, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can start. So I think as somebody mentioned earlier, I believe it was John, transportation costs continue to be the second largest household expenditure category after housing. So on average, most households spend just under $10,000 a year on transportation. For low-income households, they spend more of their income on transportation, on average just under 30%. That is a significant amount of their income. And for these low-income households, the more they spend on transportation, the less they have to meet their basic needs. And that's why affordable transportation options that are convenient and reliable is really important. So the second part of this that I heard both John and Councilor Gonzalez talk about is climate change, right? Climate change is such an intractable issue, it feels like. And Oregon has not made any progress on reducing emissions from transportation. From the transportation sector, emissions contribute to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. And according to the Oregon Department of Of the emissions generated, about 62% are from passenger cars and trucks. That means that it's generated from people driving, and we have not moved the needle on that issue at all over the past 20 years. And so there continues to be this cognitive dissonance among transportation leaders. So even though there is recognition that we must do something, the transportation policies that we have in place aren't having much of an impact. We're not investing enough in the things that will make a difference, such as non-driving transportation options. And as we observed this past summer during the heat zone, it's the marginalized communities that have suffered the most, and they will continue to suffer the most from climate change.
Thank you. Juan Carlos, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll be really quick because I think Hau just hit it right on the head. That was a beautiful description of the issue and the problem that we're facing. You know, in addition to those data points and the impact that folks have in their day-to-day lives, I think that on the policy side, we need to be updating our design standards to really make sense for the goals that we want to have. We're talking about adjusting mode share away from vehicles, creating safer, more reliable options, and really at the end of the day, what that means for our local transportation plans, our regional transportation plans, and even the state is really starting to prioritize people, climate, safety over the efficiency of transport of individual vehicles. And you know, that statement in itself is very radical in transportation and transportation engineering circles, but I do think that there is enough energy and support among people to want to fight for those changes here in Oregon, and that's the next frontier. And for people that are interested in supporting, everyone on this panel is working on that one way or another.
Thank you so much. Our next question is for John and Hau. What can communities do to support transportation options where infrastructure or funding is limited? John, do you want to start us off?
Sure. You know, I think there's a number of ways to approach this question. You know, I'm always thinking about, okay, so there's what we do to kind of plan for tomorrow, and there's also like, well, what can we do today? What can we make? How can we make the most of what we already got, even if it is pretty lacking in some areas. So you know, for me, I mean, in my position, I'm often talking with students of many different backgrounds and that live in many different parts of the region, and a lot of people are really just not fully aware of what their options are, whether it's like, you know, safe cycling routes or, you know, bus routes. And there's like, for people, like, I feel like a lot of the folks on this panel and attending are very transit conscious people and, you know, don't have issues like navigating the bus system. It just kind of comes like second nature. But there's, you know, talking to a lot of people, there's a lot of anxiety around, like, you know, using the bus. And then when they finally do, they're like, oh, wow, you know, like, this is actually really easy, and I can use this and kind of mix and match and, you know, reduce my monthly driving costs. And so, you know, I try to just connect people with information in that sense. But then I think on the other side, when it comes to like, because that only goes so far. I mean, when you live in an area that is highly car dependent, like I'm thinking specifically like, you know, for our campus, like PCC Rock Creek, very car dependent area, 185th Avenue. It's a, you know, big box strip with you know, lagoons of asphalt. You know, it's an area that's not really designed for pedestrians and biking, and I think in those cases, it's really about figuring out like a bottoms-up approach of how to you know, get people involved to create safer environments. I think that a lot of the time, like, you know, when we think about how to solve these problems, because these are big problems that we have for transportation, especially with the climate change implications. We like to think big, like big projects, big infrastructure projects that are going to take years, are going to take millions of dollars. But I try to advocate for taking, thinking more simply. There's a lot of infrastructure that can be done just like, I think of it as like human-oriented infrastructure. And that's just like, the more that can be like community organizing for safe bike routes. I mean, I think like in Portland, like Pedalpalooza is a great example of human infrastructure, where you just have like these critical mass rides that are happening all the time that make people feel safe. People kind of doing like organizing to do like try out more guerrilla transportation projects, maybe put up some bollards and cones to like reduce the driving lanes and things like that.
Thank you. Hau, do you have any thoughts to add to that? Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry, I think I unmuted and then muted myself and then unmuted and muted myself. So I was just saying that I think the reality is that the gas tax has not kept up with the cost of operating and maintaining our expansive road infrastructure. And it has not been sufficient for many, many years. So funding is always a limitation. And I'm going to push back on what Councilor Gonzalez says is a lack of resources. It's not a lack of resources. It comes down to priorities. So we need to stop expanding roads to increase the capacity for people driving, because it's a zero-sum game. You add more lanes, that encourages more people to drive, and it creates induced demand. Then you have bottlenecks and congestion, and it's a never-ending cycle of adding more lanes. And so at what point do you stop? And so back to sort of the resource issue, I know for a fact that for the Oregon Department of Transportation, of their state highway funds, they allocate 1% to biking and walking facilities. So is it a matter of limited funding, or is it a matter of shifting priorities? But I think about like other ways we can support transportation options, and I think Will brought up like pushing back on employers to do that. I know that Washington County, with their development code, like land use is closely linked to transportation, and so as much as possible when we are adding new development, that is an opportunity to support more transportation options. So are there opportunities within development codes to add good sidewalks and bike lanes and transportation options when those development comes in? We also have to stop citing schools on the fringes of these communities and then bus these kids to school, or they need to figure out how to get there in a car. And then I think like with employer-based programs, there are opportunities to think beyond the free parking, right? So what can we ask employers to do to incentivize them to look at other transportation options in their that they can provide to their employees. So just some thoughts.
Thank you so much. Our next question, let's see, is for Will and Hau. Research has shown that people of color, women, and people from lower income households are overrepresented in frontline and essential industries, holding traditionally lower wage jobs that often do not have consistent 9-to-5 schedules. How do we make sure we can effectively serve these individuals and their transportation needs? Will, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure, absolutely. So I see this question at sort of a holistic level, and this is probably the little bit of hippie in me that comes out when I saw this question. So I have to say that I want to define we here. And so I think of this in two groups. So like when we're talking about we, I'm thinking of right now, so this collection of movers and shakers on this transportation panel right now, with privilege, and it's been our standard practice to address this at policy and planning level. So we're looking at improvement and installation of infrastructure that promotes, basic levels of transportation, like sidewalks. And I'm not going to say that I don't want sidewalks. I live in Northeast Portland. It's awful to try to walk down Killingsworth, and you see these neighborhoods are jam-packed full of people, and there are no sidewalks in sight. So yes, so we need sidewalks and we need street lights, because right now what we see is a prevalence of, wide, straight motorways for vehicles. So, but what I see for we as this panel is that, of movers and shakers, is that we should be making greater investments in, that's providing resources to community-based organizations. So that's all kinds, faith leaders, neighborhood action committees, local nonprofits, local advocates. And on that last point, and I feel like it's time that we flipped the prioritization of how we do things on its head, and we flipped how we do community engagement and ask these local advocates, how do they want to be engaged? I feel like we see the same song and dance when we're out there reaching out to these communities when they say, when we think that they need our help, and then we're doing it the same way. We show up, we've got the maps, we've got the charts, and we tell them what we're doing, we ask them for their opinions, and then we just kind of move on and do the same thing. Let's flip that on its head. The other we is me talking to everyone else on this call and my neighbors and my friends. So we, as citizens, as neighbors, as friends and family, and especially those of us with privilege, so we can support by leaning on that former group that I defined, by making noise, by pushing through discomfort, and being willing to put our own privilege on the line for the betterment of all historically excluded communities.
Thank you. Hau, would you like to speak to that?
Well, I don't know how I can follow that, but I will try. When I first saw this question, I thought, you know what, we're not even effectively serving these people who have a 9-to-5 schedule. And so just layering just the non-9-to-5 schedule on top of that is really challenging. And I think oftentimes we sort of segregate our trips into commute trips and other trips. And I think when we look at transportation, we need to consider the other trips that need to be accounted for too. The one group that I really strongly identify in this work is women of color. And so in 2020, women of color lost more jobs than men as a result of having to choose between working and taking care of children or other family members. And so while this forum focuses on transportation, we need to recognize that there are systemic inequalities that need to be addressed that are layered on top of these transportation issues. So in particular, women could benefit from having access to faster and reliable transportation because they oftentimes bear that extra burden of caretaking. And I think about the transportation needs that I have as a working mother with 3 kids and a lot of privilege. And my daily travel before COVID not only included commuting to work, but picking up and dropping off kids from school, soccer practice, sometimes music lessons, or a trip to the grocery store. And for low-income or BIPOC communities that don't have transportation options, they don't have these choices. It just comes down to only making the essential trips because it costs too long, or it costs too much, or it takes too long to make those trips using transit or by walking. But I do want to bring it back to the original question. I do think there is opportunity in looking at micro-mobility, such as car sharing, Uber, Lyft, e-scooters, and bike share that can make it easier to trip chain some of these trips in these situations. And it could help address the lack of transportation options for those who are working outside of the 9-to-5 work hours and when transit isn't as available. But I think the challenge is providing these options in a way that is accessible and making these options affordable for the low-wage earners.
Thank you so much. Our next question is for Juan Carlos, John, and Hau. Across the country, communities have been subject to gentrification and ultimately displacement caused by improvements to transportation infrastructure. While WTA does not build transportation infrastructure, it does workplace-based transportation programs. What unintended consequences could workplace-based transportation programs have on a community? Juan Carlos, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, that's a huge question, but a good one. I think that the best way that I can answer that question is trying to share with folks how we're trying to address that locally. I mean, obviously, nationally, there are examples time and time again of how infrastructure with good intentions can lead to displacement, gentrification, and already in our urban centers on the West Coast, especially where we have, concentration of high-paying jobs, where we have access to opportunities, low-income folks are pushed farther and farther and farther away from these areas, and so what we have to be really mindful as local governments is making sure that these investments in major infrastructure improvements aren't just perpetuating and speeding up that vicious cycle that can feed on itself. In 2020, Metro's Get Moving Transportation measure, which was ultimately not successful, but did provide us with some good examples of what we can do for corridor investments. What we're trying to build as a best practice is building in an anti-displacement fund per project of 2%, which essentially is acknowledging that for infrastructure projects, housing and housing costs, land acquisition, investments into affordable housing development before that project is built and put into place. Trying to mobilize those things. I also spoke a little bit before about some of those equity coalitions that we have been able to put together in parts of the region, and I think that's a best practice that I would love to put together even more so that we have organized opportunities for community members, community leaders, community organizations to let us know maybe mile by mile or stretch by stretch how the project can be really intentional to avoid those displacement issues. I'm really curious to hear what my peers have to share too.
Thank you. John, do you want to share some thoughts with us on that?
Yeah. I think that at the end of the day, like we look at projects that we want to do and say like, oh, well, this time it's going to be different. Like, we're going to put in a light rail line and it's not going to displace people. But I think at the end of the day, we're all working within the same system that caused those problems in the first place. It's kind of like, and it's tricky because I think what has happened as a result is that we have a society now that's a collective anxiety to improving anything because we're just afraid of how it's going to gentrify the neighborhood, and those concerns are valid. And as someone who's a transportation advocate, it's really hard to hear people like, when I look at in Portland, they're all the time, like, bike projects, putting in new greenways. Often people block them because they're like, well, I don't want to get pushed out of my neighborhood. And I'm like, well, it's hard because I'm like, well, one, that's based around like, cycling being this idea of being an affluent thing when it's really a low cost mode of transportation. And that kind of like, framing of it, but then it is based in a reality because we see these projects happening and they keep kicking people out, and it's not just the transportation projects, it's like all improvement projects, whether it's like business improvement projects or infrastructure improvement projects or land use, and I think we just got to get to the root of it that when we improve something, it's going to increase the property values. It's going to increase the property taxes. It's going to the incentives are all wrong right now, and that until we change the incentives, and that we are able to build a train without expecting an ROI in terms of like money flooding in to that area because the train got built, then we're just going to keep looping. It's going to be just continuously looping. So I don't know. It's hard because I'm like, well, just gotta fix a broken system is really the answer that I have.
How would you like to comment on that?
Sure, I can try to add to that. So there was a research study that was recently conducted by some researchers at the University of New Mexico and I believe the University of Denver that actually showed there is no correlation between bike lanes and trails and the displacement of BIPOC and low-income people. But that's not to say that bike lanes don't contribute to gentrification because gentrification is a complex issue that goes just beyond the transportation infrastructure. And I think both John and Councilor Gonzalez mentioned the housing piece, right? So housing makes it complex. And transportation-oriented development has many benefits and the potential to increase economic mobility for lower-income people, and research shows that. It can help reduce commutes to work by driving alone. It can increase biking and walking and reduce the overall housing and transportation cost burden. But with TODs, they can have that premium effect on housing prices that can displace communities. And the challenge is we need to include affordable housing in these projects and keep them affordable, even if the real estate increases for the surrounding areas. I also think that there is the potential for improved mobility if you pair transit with new mobility and the emerging technologies. So if some of the employers or even WTA is looking to add more micro-mobility options for low-income workers, I think there are some things that may have some unintended consequences. So a lot of these new mobility options and even transit agencies are moving towards a cashless system. The big issue with that is there are issues with accessing credit cards and bank accounts, especially for Blacks and Latinx and people with disabilities. These groups are more than twice as likely not to have bank accounts. And so it's not something that is, I think there are ways to get around it, but I think like when you implement these programs, you have to take that into consideration. And then these populations are also less comfortable linking banking resources with transportation apps such as smartphones. And then there's also the issue of access to smartphones and reliable internet. And then also just having a valid driver's license to access like car share or some of these other options too may be a barrier. But I would recommend looking at the City of Portland's Transportation Wallet, which is a program, it's a pilot program that provides a set of transportation incentives for low-income participants. Some of my colleagues at PSU did an evaluation on that, and what they found was that the program did encourage some of the participants to use services such as Uber and Lyft, bike share and e-scooter, things that they would never have used before the program. And this program focused on low-income BIPOC communities. And then also the program did increase access for participants, helping them make more trips and to get places they otherwise could not have gone to. And then another lesson learned from that is having a transportation fair where you invite participants to learn more about the services and talk to the providers allowed them to increase the number of people who signed up and used these options. So.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Chris, Will, and Juan Carlos. What do you want our region to look like in 20 years, and how does transportation fit into that? Chris, would you like to start us off?
Well, the first thing I noticed is we really haven't started talking about people with disabilities and affordable housing. And I thought we were going to talk more about the Western Forest Grove area in this whole conversation. Forest Grove has many residents that are without driver's license or have trouble getting driver's licenses because of the new requirements that they have. Our main business in Forest Grove is retirement. That's what we do there. We have retirement houses, assisted living, low income, and trailer parks. That's what we have. We are a city of underserved. There's a few people with privilege, but most of us are underserved. Our city doesn't believe that a bicycle is big. So the 20-year plan would be all affordable housing has a bicycle lane connected to it, to the shopping centers, downtown region, and medical facilities. Those same bike lanes should be wide enough to accommodate adaptive mobility devices, tricycles for adults that are seniors that may have good balance but still want to be active in the transportation, and the the $10,000 a year expense for the automobile is a burden put on people that they really can't afford many times, but it's there. So safe routes to school, to shopping centers, to retirement centers, and safe routes to school should continue to high school and all the way out to PCC, because all schools are the training area where we develop the habit of not depending on the automobile. So we got kids that move up and they get to a point where they're in high school and now they have a choice, get a car or don't. So we need to put designing for disabilities first and designing for our aging population and the new mobility devices that are coming out. A hand cycle or a wheelchair with a hand cycle attachment, you can't get on a bus. And I think that those things need to change. Our simplest thing for transportation is remove seats, make space. And that's all I got.
Thank you, Chris. Will?
Yeah, absolutely. So, great question. So, my vision for the region in 20 years and how transportation fits into that. So, I'm a sucker for corny quotes, and one of my absolute favorite ones is if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. You know, so when I think of region, I love this question. When I think of region, I think of the people, and I think of the community. So, when I have a vision for our region, I'm prioritizing connection, and you and I will define connection however we want, but I'm assuming connection at all levels, person to person, person to surroundings, person to businesses, municipalities, business to business, and every iteration of that. So my vision in 20 years from now of transportation is that it's so seamless that it feels invisible. So it lessens and maybe even removes the worries about how to get to work, to the store, to school, to connect with family and friends, to the point to where we can finally focus our energies on those essential parts of life. Because, you know, we coin terms in transportation like first and last mile connections because we often get stuck thinking about the home to work trip, you know, as folks have pointed out. But we will often forget about those interstitial trips, you know, throughout the day. So what does that look like for businesses, both public and private, you know, social support services, community-based organizations and individuals, is that coming to that realization that we're all connected and we just move away from that mentality of operating on an island. So my vision 20 years from now, fingers crossed.
Thank you. Juan Carlos?
Nice. I get to go last on this one. That's awesome. Let's just say that my vision stems from a climate action, and that I hope that in 20 years we've done enough to curb our emissions and rethink our transportation infrastructure to meet the needs of the 21st century without, you know, expanding our highways like crazy or at all. I think that for me, three things come to mind immediately. The first is between now and the next 20 years, we need to have some sort of congestion pricing model that helps to affect behavior and brings incentives towards different modes. Second is, and this is something that I'm working on right now, is really making sure that this is the last era of highway infrastructure projects in Portland. We have a lot of projects right now that have been moving along that have, we've kind of inherited as this generation of decision makers, and I'm trying to say it stops here. And like Hau was mentioning earlier, the hundreds of millions of dollars that we just always find under the seat cushion, but we never find for our active transportation system, that stops now. I would say that. And then in terms of the region, what I would love to see is I want to see an integrated network of bus rapid transit that really rivals any major country, any major city, any major region throughout the world. I think that being able to integrate our trails plan, closing the gap that we have to complete our trail system, to build bike lanes and sidewalks where we need them to, but ultimately to create a bus rapid transit option that is faster, more competitive than a trip in your vehicle to wherever you need to go, is super important. And one last thing that I'll add, obviously the much of our transportation system and our trips, I think has been mentioned a few times already, is very workplace based, point A to point B, what's my commute to work, and then how do I come back? The pandemic has disrupted all of that. And when we talk about infrastructure, we need to be talking about broadband as infrastructure too. But that's a whole other workshop, whole other panel. But we absolutely need to have broadband be a part of our infrastructure conversations. And I'm hoping that when we talk about revamping our transportation infrastructure for a climate future that is sustainable and healthy, that we're really thinking about making broadband a core part of those.
Thank you so much. Our last question is for John and Chris. In what ways can organizations better engage with the communities they serve to create more targeted solutions for addressing inequitable transportation options? John, do you want to start us off there?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think just, one of the issues of how we got to the point of where we are is that we kind of shifted everything towards this top-down model where you have just people making decisions from above without understanding what actually happens on the ground below. I think about in Portland, if the people running the government at the time really cared about the people that lived and knew the people in Albina, I doubt that I-5 would have torn through and destroyed that whole neighborhood. I think that what needs to happen is government needs to get less inward and more outward in terms of actually getting boots on the ground and really listening to people and understanding what their day-to-day experience is. I also think that people in government just need to look around themselves, explore the places that they govern, walk around on foot and see what it's like. That's something that I try to do, is just go explore Portland. As a resident who lives here, I explore all different kinds of environments, and you can see how some environments are suitable to having people thrive, and other ones are not. And it's easy to understand what needs to change if you're actually interacting with that environment rather than just reading about it or talking about it. So
thank you so much. Chris, do you have any closing thoughts on that question? Oops, it looks like you're on mute there, Chris.
I think that every project needs to start with disabilities. take the most challenging person that you have and see if you can get him on the bus. If he's not on the bus, you did a bad job. That's the bottom line. So start every project with people with disabilities and the adaptive mobility device that they will use. Get the hand cycle. Get on the bike. Go see if your system will accommodate you. That's really the beginning of every project that's inclusive for the entire community. We've talked a lot about getting people to work, but what about the people that are living in assisted centers or the affordable housing that can't afford a car and cannot medically get a driver's license? We didn't talk about anybody who physically cannot have a driver's license. It's all about people driving a car to get to work. And so start off with disabilities first. That would be my guess.
Thank you so much to all of you, and it looks like we are really close to finishing on time, which is amazing because we covered, oh, okay, sorry. I thought I got kicked out for a second because we covered so much content. Before I turn it back over to the amazing WTA staff who put this together, I wanted to just ask panelists, go ahead, if you can popcorn, if you have any resources or anything that you want to share and give a shout out to, we'd love to hear that. You have about 30 seconds, anything to share on that?
Well, I have to give a shout out to my organization, TREC, because we put on a weekly Friday transportation seminar. If you go into our archives, the focus of our seminar series last fall and actually spring was on transportation equity, and so you'll find a lot of information on transportation equity and go really deep into some of these topical areas. So, and you can access it at trec.pdx.edu. Awesome.
Thank you. Any others?
I think I'd be in trouble if I didn't mention the Westside Transportation Alliance for the board that I chair. So I just want to give a shout out to all of you who put on this panel. And for those of you particularly who live and work in Washington County, please reach out to the staff at the Westside Transportation Alliance. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, we are close to ending on time. Am I handing it over to Caitlin here?
Yeah, I'll take over. Thank you, Cindy, for moderating this great panel, and thank you to all of our panelists. I thought this was a wonderful webinar. I learned a lot personally, and I hope that our audience members also learned a lot. And I know it's a huge subject and very complicated, but I think hopefully, I think we got into a lot of good subjects here, so it's a great starting spot for more discussion. And if you want to know more, if you want to become a member, if you have questions that you didn't think got answered or questions for us, our contact information is at the bottom of the screen here. It's WTA at WTA-TMA.org. And our website is WTA-TMA.org. And reach out anytime. And we'll be following up, hopefully with a recording and hopefully to answer any questions that didn't get answered and some more resources. So looking forward to talking more about all this. Thank you again for coming, and everybody enjoy the rest of their week.